Seeing so often is believing, and many eschew thoughts of using eyes abated. And in what came as a bit of a surprise move for a Republican governor this week, Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin is moving to ensure residents have quick access to the latest COVID-19 vaccines ahead of fall respiratory illness season, with State Health Commissioner Dr. Karen Shelton signing a statewide standing order this week that expands pharmacy vaccination authority. However, remember this is an election year, with all eyes across the nation focused on the gubernatorial elections in the Old Dominion state, as the midterm elections next year for Congress are just around the corner. And what would you do to win an election? For most of the nation, 5 years after the pandemic began, Americans largely see COVID-19 through the rearview mirror. But particularly for progressive voters in the Democrat Party, there are still deeply felt concerns about the novel virus, especially in a state in which 77% of the residents, just 4 points below the national average, had been administered at least one shot. Political strategists are probably banking on going soft on the COVID-19 countermeasures that had been rapidly developed at warp speed, for which the former Trump administration takes credit. And so, following the news reports, as temperatures drop and fall nears, following the usual narrative associated with infectious diseases and seasonal illnesses, COVID-19 cases are still surging in much of the country. It would probably be politically dangerous for Republicans to stir up controversy running counter to that narrative when the United States has yet to emerge from a late summer COVID wave driven by the highly infectious, as they say, new Stratus variant, which is sickening Americans from coast to coast. When they say highly contagious, they never associate that with a particular metric. No longer are they even using R naught, or reproductive number, which had been expressly rejected by the CDC in 2019. Normally, in terms of a highly contagious disease, epidemiologists will look at the infectious dose, which officially still remains unknown for COVID-19, or the secondary attack rate, which had been determined for the first variant in Wuhan to be less than 5%. That is about your chances of winning on a two-number combination at roulette. That number was revalidated in November 2020 on the first variant, the bookend study, the largest study on the first variant, looking at cases in 2 cities in India. And at the end of December 2022, as the world was introduced to the Omicron variant, there was another analysis done on exactly how infectious this contagion was, based upon 1.1 billion tests administered across the country, with only 98 million positive tests. They had determined that the uncalibrated chance of you catching COVID-19 was 8.8%. However, when one factors in reinfections based upon data gathered amongst veterans, 98% of those had been reinfections, indicating that your actual chances of getting COVID-19 were only 4.4%. Half as likely than members of the uniformed military, whether in the National Guard, Reserve, or active duty, which raises some questions that lawmakers on the Armed Services Committee are now looking at. But in politics, it is all about winning on game day in November. And while, as of September 6th, the level of COVID-19 viral activity in wastewater is considered high, again without a metric nationally, according to the latest data from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and at least 18 states are reporting very high levels of COVID in wastewater samples. Per the CDC, probably the most important thing to remember, especially in hotspots or so designated hotspots, including California, Florida, Indiana, North Carolina, Texas, and Utah, and even in the state of Virginia, where COVID-19 remains by far the number one cause of death amongst all respiratory tract infections. The numbers have fallen drastically from what had been America's deadliest years during the COVID-19 pandemic, and are falling under 10 deaths per week related to COVID-19. So for the next few minutes, let's take a time out, take a deep breath, and sound the all clear to take a reasoned examination based on the science, data-driven, with regard to the reports on COVID-19, which by 2022 had infected almost half of the members of the U.S. Congress and Senate, where the median age is around 57 for a congressman and around 67 for a senator, most of whom appear yet to have survived despite being in those most vulnerable age cohorts. Perhaps they had natural immunity. Now, one may be myopic and provincial and only respond to what is seen in the present. However, those who forget their history are quite often doomed to repeat it. So, shall we say, in the beginning, there was the Word. And the Word was virus, which are particularly intriguing in biological warfare because, unlike other living organisms, they cannot reproduce without a living host, importing an element of control. You don't want tribbles. And until 2014, in the mysterious lands of the Orient, they could not be cultivated except in a living host or in vivo, an experiment that had been replicated to produce a virus in vitro in 2015 at the UNC Chapel Hill in North Carolina, the topic of an urgent email to Dr. Anthony Fauci in late January 2020, with which some are familiar. As many cast their eyes now towards the stars again, with reports of strange objects in the cosmos. The wonders of science compel us to ponder the twinkling of the stars in the heavens, traveling millions of miles, sharing light so constant that ancient seafarers had used them for navigation. However, tragically, most of the lights in the night sky that we see now, seeing, being, believing, even according to the scientists, are only remnants of long-gone stars that had burnt out in a very cold and empty space long ago. Still, the many distant possibilities cause many in hope or prayer to ponder that because of the vastness of the universe, ceteris paribus, there must be some chance for other intelligence and alien life in the heavens. And the same conditions exist here on Earth, right amongst us, with the viruses, the most abundant of all biological particles on Earth. However, upon a painstaking accounting of all of the viruses harmful to mankind in 2014, when the Middle East respiratory syndrome had emerged on the Arabian Peninsula, there had only been a total of 219, infinitesimally small. Considering the law of large numbers, the probability of a novel emerging virus is extraordinarily remote. And in 2005, especially for the coronaviruses, Jing Lishu and Ralph Eric had explained why this number is so small in an article published in the October issue of Science. that they both had agreed that a configuration along the ORF region of the genome on a bat coronavirus would make it most unlikely that a spillover might occur, even though between 2003 and 2005, with the emergence of SARS-CoV, a total of 5 novel human coronaviruses had been added to the total, of which even today there are only 7, the 7th of which had caused a pandemic, the first of which had been discovered by joint teams at the University of Chicago and in the UK in 1965. And anyone who follows the science should most certainly know that. It was certainly abundant time under evolutionary pressure to bone up on some reading. So what happened on December 8th, 2019, the feast day of the Immaculate Conception, quite coincidentally, when, according to the WHO, a novel virus had infected the first known case in Wuhan, of which by December 31st, 2019, there would be only a total of 27 cases, no fatalities, no evidence of human-to-human transmission, 19 associated with a venue the size of 9 American football fields in the largest city in the central mainland, and the Detroit of China, especially to provide an optimal condition for not just 1, but 2 lineage strains to converge in the same location over 1,000 miles from Yunnan, where the RAC-G bat CoV, with which it had 96% affinity, is circulating in only 2 known locations. Did an extraordinary miracle happen to have occurred twice, like lightning hitting the same place multiple times, albeit without the wide publicity and societal disruption, tend to occur only 18 to 24 months. So, how, with the amazing vaccines, did a virus that worldwide had managed to beat Adolf Hitler in half the time extend its killing spree over a year longer, met with silence and spread unchecked, with denials for days, weeks, and months that led to more deaths, more infections, more stress, and more loneliness? That is the question, not reported in the press, but before the circuit court in Norfolk, Virginia, today, a case one prosecutor and his attorneys are doing everything they can to quash, especially during an election. What would you do to win an election? The truth of the matter is that as early as February 4th, 2020, the Health and Human Services Secretary had rendered a determination to tell us all exactly what this invisible enemy was, describing it as a CBRN agent or agents presenting a heightened risk of attack against military forces and citizens residing abroad. Under his authority, codified in Section 564 of the FD&C Act, enacted by Congress in 2003 to authorize the emergency use of diagnostic tests, over 1.1 billion of which had been administered by December 2022. And if you took a test, even if you thought you had been trying to determine whether you had been infected by someone with COVID-19, the purpose of the test under the law, just like the countermeasures, even according to Pfizer, Moderna, and Janssen, was to address an attack with biological weapons. But, of course, now the Congress is demanding that the American people need to know about Hellfire missiles bouncing off orbs in Yemen. Yet, upon a determination that a virus that had spread 20 to 23 countries outside China by February 4th, 2020, no national or international manhunt was commenced to interdict, apprehend, or prosecute a well-coordinated group of international terrorists. Nobody sent in tips. Nobody offered a reward. All were told simply to stay at home, mind your own business, practice social distance, keep away from others, don't say anything counter to the actions of the government, wear masks and get the shot. A matter now before the courts in Norfolk, Virginia, and also unreported in the press, despite claims in Congress about what may appear to some to be evidence of alien technology. that the American people need to know. And perhaps they do, in theory, because ignorance of the law is not an excuse, and the elections must, as always, go on. However, for those still yet unaware of the origins of this virus, about which even congressional committees and hearings had been reported on November 17, 2021, waiting until after another election, upon my simple request, the CDC had promulgated a regulation adding this novel virus, SARS-CoV-2, and its ancestral cousin, SARS-CoV, to the select list of agents and toxins, a measure designed to increase the cost of intended terrorists, now required to perform a background check and refuse to hire persons with a criminal history for transport and or storing these biological weapons, which they had described, upon my request, as chimeric viruses, which can only find origin in a lab. Most particularly, this novel coronavirus, with which most have some acquaintance, after some 4.4% of Americans had been infected, only 4.4%, and quite a few far more than once reinfected, claims of natural immunity notwithstanding. While there are over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect the avian species, birds, and over 3,000 coronaviruses that infect the mammalian species, like humans and bats, contrary to even the health experts at CNN in January 2020, there is no such thing as a reptilian coronavirus, especially not an ophidian coronavirus or snake coronavirus. And I am quite sorry, but in nature, there could be no king cobra nor Chinese crate that caused this most dreadful pandemic affair. And while others were out seeking to get elected or re-elected, I just happened to write that law, my law. What a morning when disguise begins to fall. A matter now in courts, both in Norfolk as well as Richmond and also in D.C. My law, what a morning when disguise begins to fall.